There's a saying in Chicago, there's only two seasons. There's winter and then there's construction season. So this is meant to be like a play on like hunting season, but construction season. My name is Sonsyadek. I was born in Ukraine, grew up in Chicago, went to school for 4 years at my ed in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, then stayed a couple years after that, just kicking it and getting by. And then after that, I moved back to Chicago, and now I've been back for about 3 or 4 years. I primarily was just doing paintings throughout my time in college, and then even after that when I came out, but it's always been kind of based in the idea of collage, even though I never really made collages all that much. Like I would here and there as like part of an assignment or something. But I just really like the idea of approaching something in a collage sensibility, meaning like you could sample different moments from whatever like visual history you might want to incorporate and use to your own ends. Recently, I didn't have a lot of time to be in the studio, and the way I found kind of relief to supplement that and still be productive in terms of art making was to start messing around on Photoshop. But the way I usually explain how I use Photoshop is kind of like using a hammer and nails to like cobble things together. Like it's not an eloquent process by any means. It's just like cutting and pasting. Than like what's over there. And then these are collages that I did on the computer that I got printed out. Mainly the thing that's been ongoing in my work is the kind of parallel that I noticed between observing like my environment and how I noticed that I tend to work, which is really piecemeal. It's like addressing one thing at a time, whereas a lot of painters might approach a painting kind of in a gestalt sensibility, working all at once. For me, it's easier, or somehow that's just kind of how I build out my paintings, is like a piece at a time to build towards a greater whole. A lot of layering, lots of overlap, and that kind of interested me in terms of what I was observing in different neighborhoods in Milwaukee and especially in Chicago, just because of how I guess development works and how gentrification functions. You'll have a lot of older buildings getting knocked down, new developments coming in, building up, to where certain neighborhoods kind of look like a mishmash depending on where they are in that process. So a lot of it is really just about the compression of like what is considered natural by most people, so trees, plants, what have you, and how we kind of bend that to our will sometimes in the context of like a city environment, as well as like the actual man-made objects, so buildings, all the construction materials that are lying around, just pretty much everything that you would see in the city. The safety vest over it, so kind of like a secondary version of that to like a full garb. I consider a lot of my work, if not all of my work, to be technically landscape paintings, but it's not traditional landscape paintings by any means, just because like there's not a lot of like formal aspects to it. There's not usually a horizon line, there's not a lot of atmospheric perspective, none of that. A lot of it is just overlapping things to create space. But in terms of actually pulling imagery or sampling work, it can come from anywhere. A lot of what happened when I started making collages was I would have all these photos that I would take on certain trips or just like walking around the neighborhood, to use as source materials, but I would never really look at it. But when I started making those digital collages, I finally had like an excuse, like, oh, I could go back in and pull all these like this massive pool of imagery that I took that I never used or did anything with. And also aside from that, I really got into kind of like touring around the city, but I would go on Google Street View and just kind of like go around neighborhoods in that way, and then do a lot of like screen caps and stuff, and then just start utilizing that into my work.
Larger pieces. I mean, you pretty much have a.
It's just that one and this one.
So yeah, we put those in the area strategically where you have a ton of room to approach it.
Right.
having, all this space to play with. One thing I thought of within like the last month, in conjunction with doing these tarp paintings, was to simply just buy a tarp. And so those are about 6 by 8 feet or 8 by 10 feet. And I've never really done anything that big. Not to mention with that kind of material, I don't necessarily know how spray paint is going to react on it. So it'll kind of be a really impromptu test session and see if it works out.
You can just start it on that one with yellow. Okay.
A lot of the jobs that I've held kind of relate to the stuff that I make. Like I used to be a cable guy in Milwaukee for a couple of years. So really you're like literally you're crawling around these houses, digging through people's backyards. You're just integrated into that mishmash of like the natural and the man-made. After that, I worked for a small real estate developer. Again, kind of draws to the stuff I like making work about. To now, where I recently, in the last 2 months, became a realtor in Chicago. And that either has an influence on my work, or maybe I got into those positions because that's what I was just interested in. That's what I noticed going on around me. Technically, I view my work as based in landscape. I guess also pulling from like certain historical ideas of like what landscape is, because landscape paintings used to be that, it's this kind of like lofty notion of this uninterrupted expanse of, rolling hills and forests, mountains, whatever, completely unimpeded by man. You go out there to experience nature as it is. Whereas, in a city, that's a completely different idea. Like, we use nature or bring that into our own natural environment, which is, concrete and what have you. So I guess the historical ideas of like what landscape painting is also kind of worked their way in there somewhere. And part of like the landscape that I observe around me is a lot of new development. And however you choose to look at it, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's happening.